the advent of emerging technologies like AI, quantum, and autonomy, it's even going to get increasingly harder just because of that supply chain integrity issue as well.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. I'm Haleigh Horan, and today I am joined by Alicia Chavy. And on behalf of the N Network, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to meet with me today and speak about your career in the future of national security. So, to start off, would you mind providing the listeners with a brief overview of your background, such as how you got here, and then we can delve into other aspects as we continue throughout the podcast?
Of course, thank you, Haley, for hosting me, and hello to everybody. I'm Alicia Chavy. I'm a vice president at Beacon Global Strategies, a national security and geopolitical risk consulting firm. I'm also a board member of the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, a fellow with the Trilateral Commission, and with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. A bit of my background, I was born and raised in France, but I moved here when I was 14. And I really deep dived into the national security issues right off the bat, from school to some work experiences, managing and switching between think tank, research and policy to private sector, and with a mix of hospitality. So, really, that chief of staff mindset and making sure you're flexible in the different hats that you're wearing, whether that's policy advising to strategy execution to, event coordination. And some of my think tank experiences have been at the American Foreign Policy Council, the CSIS, and as well as being a research assistant for Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who is a renowned terrorism expert in the US.
That's a wonderful background. I would love to know a little bit more about how the experience has been going from France to the United States and how integrating within our national security realm differs or is similar to what you may have learned over there, if you can speak on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because Europeans view national security and security-based issues differently than the United States. And so moving here as a teenager, there was a lot that was still yet to be framed. But the Bataclan terrorist attacks in 2015, having some close friends that were impacted by that, and then the Pulse Orlando attacks because of where I grew up in Orlando, plus 9/11, growing up with this really kind of shaped that mindset that national security is not just a country-based issue, but really a global issue. And so that's what really attracted me first to studying terrorism and substate violence through school and in my graduate studies at Georgetown Security Studies program. But more importantly, like, what are the level of responsibilities and layers between nation states and governments and businesses and non-state actors? And so how do we as a population respond to that? So for France, we view national security and others, because France is just much smaller than the state of Texas. There's a lot more heavy weight on certain issues that per se here you wouldn't necessarily think of. And so also the interconnectedness of the European continent to Africa, MENA, and some of the immigration issues, as well as the spread of violent terrorism beliefs in certain areas, has shaped French national security apparatus much differently than how the US is really approaching it.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, like you said, it's not just, country based. It's all of us working together towards this issue. And so with that, how have you seen the latest national security policies shaping the type of risks and challenges that, businesses or countries may be seeing today?
Yeah, that's a great question again. So we went from the Cold War to 9/11 and the global war on terror to now there's over the years a shift towards great power competition, particularly China and Russia threat framing. That has been much embedded within the national defense security strategies that have been released over the last few years and even more now. We also have a little bit more of a shift of Western Hemisphere in this current administration, which is really much a return to home and addressing the border security, southern border, and security threats on transnational crime that has been plaguing some of our national economy and issues. And the way that I've been seeing it from the multiple organizations that I've been involved in throughout the last few years is that businesses are now grappling with that national security is a shared responsibility. And so they're starting at the C-suite level and understand the implication from Ukraine conflict to Iran. And just now with the Strait of Hormuz, you even have the financial sector, hedge funds, and other organizations that are starting to think, wait, why does this matter? And obviously, they've paid attention most closely in the last few years for geopolitical risk, but now thinking what are the implications and what can they do about it? And so it's definitely broadened the organization lens towards systemic risk. So supply chain integrity, technology transfer, how do we operate in contested and denied environments? Do we stay connected? How can we still share data and leverage AI, through those public-private partnerships? And so now when you're sitting at that crux of issues, how do you partner? How do you mitigate risks from a cybersecurity perspective? And how do you ensure that export control sanctions and others affect how that affects your market position and how to navigate that environment? It's gone increasingly complex through the years, and with the advent of emerging technologies like AI, quantum, and autonomy, it's even going to get increasingly harder just because of that supply chain integrity issue as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been something that people didn't have as much focus on, especially until recently, with, like you mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz and seeing how that has had such a global impact. And I think that that will really bring forward that nationwide or global perspective that, we continue to see lack within different proposals and policies. And I think also with what you mentioned with America's shift in their national defense strategy and their national security strategy being more home-based perspective, rather than being, on those other fronts that we've seen in the past proposals that have been sent out. How do you potentially see partners and allies, I guess, shifting their focus on how America is right now with their strategies they're putting forward?
Yeah, I mean, we can't do anything alone, and we'll definitely need partners, and we'll definitely be needing trade partners and technology partners and development and R&D. But one of the critical things that have happened over the last decades is that we've lost a tremendous amount of knowledge and labor and high skill in very specific emerging technology areas that are at our detriment now. So semiconductors, there's a 5G issue. And so by letting certain adversary-based companies or companies that are, from, as we would call them, competitors, the states, allow them to expand the market share in the US, it comes at the detriment of one of our competitiveness abroad, but at home as well, comes at the cost of jobs and that high skill institutional knowledge. And so how do we reinvest and shore up at home, really take care of those sectors? So it's the automotive industry, as you see, there's a lot of that vertical supply chain integration that companies are now having to grapple with because of export control and sanctions for certain products and components that they were dependent on China and other regions. So now, how do we help build that up without bankrupting ourselves? And at the same time, where do we find areas where we can partner and collaborate? We do have really tremendous allies, and that will never go away. Coming from a European background, there are certain areas where I do see Europe playing a great fit in partnering, and how American companies can also help European companies shore up and leverage American expertise to be able to build up those resources in Europe as well. And so that's one piece. We saw that with the CHIPS Act and how we were trying to shore that up at home. Universities, nonprofit, and labs, and companies, and the government, all whole of government effort is happening right now to be able to shore up chips manufacturing in the US. And we do have partners that are from Taiwan. So it's not a no non-American companies can come in. It's really being more mindful of how we can scale up.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, it's not, I think everyone's perceiving it to be like only America and that's it. But it's important to give that distinction of we are working still with partners and those who are just as driven to have things such as the chips or like working to figure out the semiconductor path and things like that. Um, you know, with China in particular, as you noted, with semiconductors and their, race with technology, particularly AI, um, how can we ensure as the United States, like how do you see that shifting with our partners as well, um, and ensuring that we remain on pace?
Yeah. One of the biggest gap in the way I see the US approaching AI and cyber is that it's a procurement speed and capability maturation. The commercial sector has tremendous developments and commercially available solutions that we could be adopting for the government and for our society. But we're seeing the government right now funding aggressively in AI, but they lack some of the acquisition frameworks to be able to sustain and govern this at scale. So, for instance, you're thinking AI pipeline, you're thinking the scaffolding for the actual platform, the energy resources, the computing power, and then you have to think about the model development and then the companies that can help deploy those models. So there's a lot of connectivity there that is existing, and there is just how do you sustain that? And then on the cybersecurity front there is a persistent gap in treating IT and cyber environments with the same rigor as other vulnerabilities that are physical. And one attack on critical infrastructure or water system could be very detrimental to an entire city or region. So making sure that we treat cybersecurity as a persistent threat and it's a means to an end for a lot of adversaries, whether that is ransomware. There's post-quantum cryptography that's coming down as well. A lot of people believe quantum day is so far behind, so far ahead that it's the future. We don't have to worry about it. But we have a lot of our competitors are actively trying and actively stealing our data today. And the data shelf line is about 20 years. So even though it's encrypted and you can't do much about it, the moment our adversaries and competitors have developed a quantum viable computer to be able to decrypt within seconds, then a lot of the high value assets and high value data that they were able to steal today would still have a shelf line that would be detrimental to our national security. So overall, how can the US have a coherent deterrence doctrine for defensive and offensive cyber, and same with AI? And how do we sustain the procurement, sustain the scaling of these capabilities, both within the government and within society? I'm not calling for robots and replacing jobs. I'm calling for how do we leverage AI enabled capabilities to maximize and augment our abilities as workers. And so not to replace, but be a force multiplier. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now that's delaying us in the international scene.
Yeah, you said that quantum day is far away. I think we're already seeing how it's really not. I myself, as a student, in particular with the use of Canvas, as we've all seen
Yeah.
recently, there's been a large-scale attack that happened yesterday. Um, and I think a lot of people, as you also mentioned, just don't really think about the cyber threat in the cyber realm. I read a book one time, I think it's called Lights Out, and how it talks about the our energy grid or like the just the grid in general of how old it is and how it really only takes one attack to it and then we would be without power. We would be without, our telecommunication systems, all of the different things that we rely on each and every day that, when things such as Canvas shutting down or, if our flights were to shut down, that we just don't think about as much as like other threats such as terrorism or, other things like that. So, a lot of people see the public and the private sector as kind of two different entities. They don't really seem to mesh together. Do we see that currently happening with the private and public sector working towards the no, the defensive and offensive cyber plans?
Yeah, absolutely. And that thanks for raising the canvas example because it seems so innocuous, but it impacts students and impacts editors and impacts many people that depend on Canvas for their livelihood, for work. There are many watershed moments that have happened this year with AI and developments and AI security and cybersecurity. Companies, it's treating it very seriously now, and the government has been treating it very seriously. So I do think we're seeing a growth and spur in public-private partnership. One of the things that's been interesting from the various experiences I've had from different sectors is like think tanks that are producing the ideas and non-governmental organizations, they test them against the human reality. Consulting firms typically operationalize and think through the strategies around it. Their journey across that with the businesses and how can each player have a part in national security and overall in the conversation we're having. And so it's really important for the think tanks to keep an eye out on those developments and call out for key recommendations for companies and government and NGOs to be able to enact, and then to see that Rolodex just fall through. So we're seeing it, and I think that we're starting to see a lot more focus as well from all these three different or four different entities I mentioned on how to be able to ha shift away from what's the right answer, like what do we need to do today, but what can actually make meaningful changes and how can we validate and really move towards a concrete goal altogether. So that's not just a selfish move per, this report recommended we address 5 zero-day vulnerabilities. We've done it. We've done our part. We're no longer responsible. So how are we all responsible without having to bear the cost of the full responsibility? And so moving that thread is going to be very difficult, but I see it happening.
And with the acquisition framework that you also highlighted, do we see that there will be that partnership across those four entities as well to try and build towards that? Or could you speak more on that acquisition framework that you said is not really present and being focused on?
So it's present, it's just fragmented.
Okay.
There's been an incredible amount of acquisition overhaul happening over the last 2, 3 years, both from the Department of Defense on the acquisition reforms, but just in general, the government. And they're really trying to move at speed and scale without having any cumbersome regulations and compliance issues to slow down the process. But at the same time, how can you de-risk the process without augmenting the risk when you're foregoing certain compliance? So the checks and balances are working right now. They're just kind of rebalancing things. The acquisition framework is definitely improving, and they had to break down with a hammer a lot of the different frameworks that were in place to put in together new entities, new offices, and empower people. And it's the key here for the success will definitely be the empowerment of people. Now that there are certain reforms in place, how can the contract officers, the acquisition officials feel empowered? And then there's another, third question mark on the acquisition reforms, which is the midterm election and the budget cycle. Those are macro drivers that are outside of our control that, Congress and the president are dealing with and negotiating day to day. But those are the things that are going to impact our ability to acquire and sustain and procure capabilities that can make our day-to-day lives easier.
It's really interesting. I didn't really know much about that, I guess, per se. So it was interesting to learn about how it currently is and where it, should evolve towards going. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, you've had a lot of different experiences with various organizations. And I would like to know a little bit more about the policy side of things. So, how has your viewpoint or perspective changed regarding policy advising with all the different things that are coming into light and in focus for different people and governmental institutions today?
Yeah, I think I was just mentioning that earlier on the three pieces of think tanks, NGOs, and the government and consulting firms. I think each play a part in the puzzle. What's been interesting when I started at Kroll was learning how to digest a vast amount of information and helping with corporate due diligence and investigation. You start seeing bits and pieces of puzzles of, regulatory, judicial, political, security risks. But then I felt that I was missing a bit of that connectivity. And so I went to grad school And now, through some of my work experiences, is you may not have the full picture, and that's okay. You can't have all the answers, but how do you become a subject matter expert or subject matter aware so that you can help move the needle enough? The truth is you're always going to have companies that have the best engineers, the best team, the best R&D scientists. You're going to have government stakeholders that have the best acquisition officials, and you're going to have think tanks with the best experts in cybersecurity. And so how can they all come together and talk to each other and translate to each other what they're trying to say to each other because they speak different languages? And so I think that's where the policy advising comes in, is translating those different languages and how to help move the needle. And again, the burden sharing of responsibility doesn't mean that you're in the private sector or you're on the other side that you're not responsible for X and Y. I think it's making sure that we're all believing in the cause. And, our national security for Americans is therefore so important. So how do we protect that and how do we contribute day in, day out?
Yeah, I think that's really important to note of just like, uh, as we've touched on a couple times already, the cohesiveness rather than that continued fragmentation and things like that. We kind of briefly started our conversation regarding terrorism and that landscape. Um, so I'd like to go back to that for a little bit. Um, and so I wanted to know, with terrorism and the terrorism threat landscape, how have you seen it evolve in recent years, and how do you see the emerging technology that we've talked about as well playing a role in the way that terrorist organizations plan or recruit or operate?
Yeah, that's going back to what I studied and and what I really truly found fascinating. Really, I see it as the landscape is quite fragmented. The hierarchical state agency model of Al Qaeda that gave way to ISIS's more hybrid proto state. Now we're in an era of ideologically diffuse um, tech-enabled lone actors and small cells. So a lot, we've seen some Iranian backed cells, right? There's some that are now backed with greater state funds or greater backers. And we've seen, on the Ukraine and Russian front, how unmanned systems and drones and cheap equipment could have detrimental effects to legacy platforms. And so, you know, lone wolves and terrorists are seeing this, and they're also looking at new technology or novel ways to capture attention. So like cybersecurity, how do you grab for ransomware for financial reasons, but as well as causing fear? And so can you augment that psychological impact that you're hoping to have as a terrorist organization through different means. And so the means have kind of broadened in terms of the emerging technology front. So it's become a force multiplier at every stage. Encrypted platforms for recruitment, radicalization, access to a broader audience, AI generated propaganda for narrative warfare, for causing, discord in other society and trying to influence or retract some narratives abroad, and then commercial drones and open source information for operational planning. The barrier to capable low signature attacks has dropped significantly, and they could have, in their perspective, a greater impact than if they were to organize this very exquisite, elaborate attack. Um, and as I mentioned, cyber hackers and transnational criminals have also emerged as non-state actors that are threatening to our national security.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the fact of lone actors. As someone who's studying counterterrorism and homeland security at American University currently, that's something that's really become an interest of mine, of trying to figure out their origins, how they operate, um, and how, the government or even nonprofits are working towards, or non-governmental organizations are working towards, figuring out how to determine them or see what the triggers are through various social media platforms. So I guess my question for you is now on social media and how that plays a role as a technology source for them in the recruitment and things like that. How is that being perceived?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, social media manipulation has been there for a while, given the advent of Instagram, Facebook. So they've definitely used that as a way to radicalize and recruit. From when I studied, interestingly enough, I think there's a lot of algorithm shaping and companies that are trying to tackle these threats, such as the main social media platforms have teams that are entirely dedicated to trying to counter some of those efforts. So I would say that it's TikTok as well has increased their aperture, but it's even harder as well, just because of the stronger outlook from companies to address these. Europe has some pretty strict rules for companies to be able to address this from a child safety perspective, but also terrorism threat. So with the advent of AI, it's been great for them, but it's also been a counter because of the way that we can now look at the algorithms and how we can move away from certain things that are exposed to us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense because I had the opportunity to, just examine the Mexican cartels and their presence online through like Twitter and Facebook when I was a intern at a different organization. And it was just truly fascinating to see how easy it was to find them and to see like how they didn't really do much to stay hidden. So that was just a really interesting perspective and something that I've really wanted to delve into more myself
And
with those realms.
you've seen one of the social media platforms, Instagram, I believe enacted a way to reduce bots presence on the
Hmm.
platform. And so I mean, not consequential impact is as some celebrities and people have less followers, but consequentially, it does remove the ability to create as many bots as possible for nefarious actions like cyber ransomware or terrorism radicalization or any kind of outreach that a adversarial lone wolf was trying to attempt.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting to see just the shift there, and how things have evolved. I think, just with terrorism in general, seeing how before it was kind of on the ground type of communication strategies, and then as, the news became more prominent and things like that, they had different sources. So I think it'll just, unfortunately continue to evolve as the technology does. But one last question before we close out. Uh, you've had, again, a lot of different experiences and had different roles with different organizations. What is one piece of advice you would give our audience, to anyone listening, on how to become involved in this field, or just any advice in general?
Ah, yes. I would say curiosity has led me to show up, go to events, curiosity, ask the questions, meet people. Obviously, Washington, D.C. is a networking city, so if anyone wants to talk and needs some advice, we can definitely be there for folks. But I think the showing up matters and the curiosity, asking questions, showing that you care. And being flexible. I mean, if you look at my trajectory, I started as due diligence corporate investigator with multiple language to terrorism and state violence to now emerging technology and national security. And there's a lot of these different things that are evolving and how these issues come as the hot topic of the day, like China, Western Hemisphere, the regional. So if you want to be a regional expert, that's fantastic. And there's that language requirement that would come in handy, but it evolves. Like we had a lot of the Middle East experts, and then it was China, and then it was Asia Pacific, and now it's back to Middle East, and now it's back to Latin America. Um, I think for me, I chose the functional area just because even though I have the language expertise, I was more interested in the connectivity of these issues and how they impact one another. All that to say, whatever path you choose, it's going to be okay, but show curiosity and continue to ask the questions. Asking questions will always lead you to more and more, and to know that you being flexible to understanding that you might end up like me learning about quantum and AI, and suddenly that's what you want to work on every day. And being okay knowing that terrorism assisted violence like taught me a lot, and it showed me the connectivity of state and businesses and non-state actors. And so that connectivity tissue, I started asking the questions, but why? How? Where do we go next? And so that would be my best advice.
Well, thank you so much. Those are great pieces of advice to hold on to, even for myself. So, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you.